Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the Professor, and this is the Moment of Truth. As the suck-ups in the left corner of the white media still struggle to try to comprehend how Trump could have won the election so overwhelmingly, they've actually, some of them, begun to do what they should have done from the beginning. Be honest with themselves about how Kamala was dodging black voters. Look, family, there's not going to come a headline that says black voters are the only ones who decide the elections, all other demographics are either too small to matter or too many of them are in the tank for the Republicans to have a cohesive whole. They're not going to actually say that. But understand, under white supremacy, the white media acts as not just a propaganda bullhorn, but also as a means of internal communication to white supremacists to alert them to things that they may be missing. That's the function that it actually serves. Externally, their messages are supposed to be brainwashing the masses through the relentless use of propaganda narratives. But internally, the white supremacists are informing one another and telling each other things that they probably are not paying attention to but should be. That's the reason why the New York Times, the paper of record, did a bit of accidental journalism last week when they looked at how the Harris campaign's failure to reach black voters in Philadelphia was an example of the campaign's national failure. A former Harris campaign organizer, Amelia Purnell, told the New York Times they hadn't talked to anybody. It was like, hey, nobody has come to our neighborhood. The campaign doesn't care about us. Purnell, alongside other Harris campaign volunteers, believed that the campaign leadership was ignoring black voters and instead focusing their efforts on white suburban voters. Now that was coming from the New York Times, mind you, exactly what the black media has been telling you all along. So here they are, bringing up the rear as usual, the white media. A month after the election, they're just now publishing a piece that dares to say what we've been telling you all along. The Harris campaign's failure is because their entire strategy was to try to appeal to white suburban women. When they say suburban, that's what they actually mean. The white media already admitted that Trump's message was already resonating with white male voters in particular, and Harris's entire campaign was about abortion. That's supposed to be mattering to white women, especially college-educated white women, which is what you're going to be finding out there in the suburbs. So that's what they mean. They use these code words, but the black media already deciphered it for you and told you about it long before the white media decided to put their own little sanitized spin on it. For several years now, the black media has been telling you about how the Democrats have been pivoting to try to find a way to put together some new voter coalition, one that would not be dependent, or as the Democrats see it, vulnerable to black voters' demands. So they've been trying to appeal to immigrants, they've been trying to appeal to white women, they've been trying to appeal to the LGBT community, anyone and everyone at all, and as Rahm Emanuel said when he gave away the game, Biden Republicans he called them. In other words, all this Bill Clinton stuff been going on since at least the 90s of Democrats trying to figure out how do we appeal to these right-of-center voters, white voters who may be fiscal conservatives but who are socially liberal, and that's the button that the Democrats have been trying to push ever since. This was their top priority because the overarching goal of the Democrats was making sure that black political demands never become national policy. They ran away from the base because they saw that in more and more places that they went to, black voters were talking about reparations, and black voters were talking about tangibles, specifically for us. Their pathetic attempts to pretend to have a black male agenda didn't fool anyone. The same way that 4 years ago, when you had Mike O'Malley or Martin O'Malley, whoever that clown is out there in Baltimore, he was sitting there claiming that all lives matter. We hear you when you say Black Lives Matter. All lives matter. Even their own audience wasn't fooled. Even their own audience called him out on it. So the Democrats have been doing this for a long time now, trying to see if they could BS their way past the voters, pretending to acknowledge what you say, and then in the very next breath dismissing it. The New York Times is confirming that as Harris and the Democrats saw it, the enemy was not Donald Trump. It was the political demands of black voters. That was the real enemy that they had to defeat. They decided that they would rather see Trump back in the White House than to do what the party's base told them to do. And that's why, once again, we're seeing the Democrats and those in the so-called leftist white media who have been banging the drum to once again flood the zone with the talking point that the party's too woke. The Democrats lost because they're too woke. It's those woke, read black people who are talking all of this extremist stuff. They're the ones who cost us the election. Remember nigga Jim Clyburn, America's favorite sharecropper? 4 years ago, in an election that the Democrats won, he was whining and complaining as if they had lost. Remember? Stop sloganizing, kill, stop it with all this defund the police stuff. He was sitting there whining that his boy, his hand-picked puppet Jamie Harrison, lost his Senate race. Meanwhile, when Jim Clyburn decided, let's make Jamie Harrison the head of the DNC, well, here we are 4 years later, and we can see what Jamie Harrison's leadership of the DNC produced. It produced a defeat. Whereas 4 years ago, when Jim Clyburn was whining and complaining about all of those woke people online, they were the ones who handed Democrats the control of the White House and both houses of Congress. And yet, 4 years ago, Jim Clyburn was whining and complaining as if the Democrats had lost. So I want you to remember that whenever you got these talking heads on MSNBC and CNN, and you got some Democrats saying the party's too woke, has gone too far to the left. No, it was all of those woke people who actually handed Democrats a clean sweep control of the government. Meanwhile, the Democrats, listening to nigga Jim Clyburn and others, they decided that they were going to play to those white suburban women, and they lost everything. They lost the White House, they lost the House of Representatives, they lost the Senate, they lost the Supreme Court. But this is not something that you're going to be hearing from either the quote-unquote left media or the Democrats. They're not going to be saying, well, you know what? It's not actually those people on the far left. It's the party itself. In fact, if they had run to the left, they would have actually gained things. They wouldn't have lost the Senate at the very least. But they can't admit to that because for Democrats, it's not about winning elections. It's about maintaining the racial order in America. So the New York Times is admitting what we've been saying all along, that there's disgruntled former Kamala Harris campaign staffers who may or may not have gotten paid, who are venting their frustration that Harris's campaign ignored black voters. And that being the case, Philadelphia is a case study in how they failed nationally. How the world do you allow a crucial swing state that has a Democrat as governor and has an asinine, crazy Democrat like John Fetterman as a senator there, and yet you lose that state? It's because you didn't decide to talk to the voters, you tried to talk around them, and it didn't work. And by the way, yeah, the article likes to throw in the word brown when talking about who Kamala Harris was ignoring, but that's just verbal window dressing. They can't say black in isolation because they never do, because our political demands are so threatening now that to even mention us is a threat, so they have to throw in other folks like labor or abortion advocates, Latinos, etc., because they can't say black in isolation. That would be too dangerous. But the problem is black voters, because we're the ones that they need in order to win. So the Times looked at Pennsylvania as a case study in Harris's failure, and the first thing they point out is that she wasn't really trying to talk to black voters. Gee, maybe she thought that Josh Shapiro would be her Negro whisperer or something. Well, whatever she was thinking, her staffers were upset that there didn't seem to be anyone reaching out to black voters. They actually had to put their own money together and go ahead and go rogue and try to reach black voters on their own. Now, according to the Times, these Kamala Harris staff members who were trying to keep her campaign on life support out there in Philadelphia, they described that the place had dirty field offices that lacked basic supplies like tables and chairs, or ones for majority black areas that weren't anywhere near the center of voters that they were trying to reach. So the campaign was ignoring black voters, but also making it a point to show contempt. Dirty field offices, yeah, to go along with her dirty attitude. But this is what her own volunteers were finding, so they decided that they had to go rogue, and we're just going to have to go ahead and do this ourselves and try to do the voter outreach because there's no leadership on this. Yeah, because Kamala Harris was desperately trying to figure out how does she bang the drum of abortion in the hopes that those white female voters out there in the suburbs who don't live in Philadelphia, that hopefully they would be moved by that message. And it was all about how do we do an end run around the black vote, and she found out you can't. But even after all that, what these campaign staffers still fail to understand is that this wasn't Kamala Harris's ineptitude to blame so much as it was fear. The message of the black media has gotten to the grassroots, and more black people, especially that all-important under 50 group, those are the ones who are going to decide where the Democratic Party, and by extension American politics, goes over the course of the next 30 to 40 years. That group of black folks in particular are getting bold about making demands. They're not concerned about whether or not you got some bought and paid for sellout like nigga Jim Clyburn saying, oh, stop sloganizing, it ain't feasible, that ain't gonna work. They don't care. What they care about is their demands being heard. That's called intellectual courage. Kamala Harris was trying to engineer controlled, tailored audiences that she could talk to have these little curated gatherings that would be front-loaded with DNC volunteers and shills. She wanted to stick to safe spaces like those staged, pathetic barber shop PR stunts she was trying to pull. She can't talk to the black street because the black street doesn't respect her. She would have had to face all kinds of hostile questions, and she wasn't about to do that because this woman never actually had the ability to take on a tough interview to begin with. All she had were a bunch of talking points given to her by her DNC handlers, and she found out the hard way on more than one occasion that wasn't enough. And some of these bitter Harris staffers set up a call with Angela Rye, of all people. Talk about the queen of the incompetent operative class. Angela Rye is in the same category as Simone Sanders, only without a crappy MSNBC show. But these are the people who the staffers went running to. Rye and Charlemagne the Fraud and these other bootlicks, they got out there and sold the soap for Kamala, and she's still lost by a landslide. Not in spite of these bootlicks' efforts, but because of the bootlicks. That's why you saw Charlemagne on The View talking like he was about Biden, because he's trying to regain some of that illusion of credibility that he thinks he might have once had. But nobody is fooled. Everybody recognizes that these guys are meat puppets for the white media. That's because more and more black folks are listening to black media. No matter what the New York Times may say, or rather refuse to say, everyone recognizes the road to the White House runs through the black community. There is simply no substitute for the black community's political cohesion. No other group is as solidly united in their votes as we are. But something else that we have that no other demographic does is the moral legitimacy to stand forward and say this is what this country's doing right and what it's doing wrong. And it's precisely because we have indicted the majority of this country that we are hated and also feared, because they understand that they may have a white media that can shout us down, but in the long run, absolutely nobody's going to make us back down. And if any politician thinks that they're going to have a substitute for that, especially the Democrats, well, we'll just run to this demographic over here, run to that one over there. We'll ignore black people and they'll be politically irrelevant. Well, they tested that little theory. They decided to go ahead and let Jim Clyburn and his clowns like Jamie Harrison run the show, and they see exactly what they got out of that. A high-profile, humiliating defeat. And just for the record, or should I say just for the paper of record, we don't need the New York Times or any other white media outlet to echo what it is that we say. We know what the truth is. But it is good to see how these guys, after all of their lies, after all of their ducking and dodging and obfuscations, after all the pathetic attempts that they made to try to attribute Kamala Harris's loss to the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, anyone and everyone except for black people, eventually, at least a few of them have to admit the reality. But for those of you who listen to the black media, you already knew about this not months but years ago. See, Kamala Harris thought to herself that as long as she had certain white media outlets who were in the tank for her, well, even without black folks' support, she could just flood the zone with her message, and that would be a substitute for all of those now disaffected and disgruntled black voters. But it didn't work. And that's because neither the New York Times nor any other white media outlet has any more influence with the black grassroots than Charlemagne the Fraud, Angela Rye, or Kamala Harris. The most intelligent and cutting-edge political analysis that you're going to get isn't going to come from the talking empty heads on cable television or from the professional scribblers that are working in these magazines and newspapers. The best kind of analysis you're going to get is going to come from the black grassroots itself. We spent a lot of time talking about it because it's important that not just you, but people who are new to this message understand that when they're listening to voices like mine, not only are they going to be kept up to date, but they're going to be ahead of the curve. So let this stand as yet another in a seemingly endless string of examples of how you can either tell the truth about where the black grassroots stands before the election, or you can do like the New York Times and wait until after the election when you've lost not only the voters, but also your audience and your own credibility too. Good day, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors: Starlet Thompson, Deep I 904, Gregory Franklin, Pamela Hyman, and Sakina Collins. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.